let me introduce myself first. So thanks to Adam for inviting me. I appreciate it. It was a nice invitation. I am an applied linguist who works in science education. Now, from what I know about people when they hear that, you're thinking grammar and nasty red lines on your writing. I'm not that kind of linguist. So my core training is in creating psychometrically valid tests. Think psychometric tests or things like that, the SATs, tests like that. So quantitative research, creating tools. For the last, God knows how long, 25 years or so, I have been working primarily in science education, primarily in microbiology education. And I have two primary roles. One is I do assessment and evaluation, but I consider that to be a byproduct actually of my other role, which is I do educational research. I design course-based research programs and different types of educational program. And primarily I develop psychometrically valid tools so that whatever we are trying to do can be evaluated, we can assess it, we can say something about it, we can use it. And if you stick my name in Google, you'll find a whole set of papers which are very, very boring, but they have tools in them at the end, all publicly accessible. Please use them. They're free, open, they're usually funded, so they're open for everyone to use. Okay, so actually, today, I'm not actually going to talk about assessment, but I do want to talk about where this study comes from and put some parameters on it. So I'm in the process of developing what I consider to be more informative, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, but more informative and more psychometrically valid inclusion scales. So everything I'm going to present is actually data I collected in order to create a set of scales, which I'm now actually validating. If you invite me back next year, I'll present these psychometrics on them. But the aim was to develop a set of tools which are more informative. Now, what does it mean more informative? My whole approach to assessment is one of formative assessment. In other words, I don't evaluate or assess in order to write you a letter with an A, B, C, D, or E in it. What I do is I create tools which can give you information which can allow you to do your jobs in a better way, or to point out where you're doing a fantastic job and areas which might need some more support. So that's what I mean by informative. And there are inclusion scales, but I have found them not as informative as I would like them. I'm not bashing my colleagues. I just think they were doing something different from what I'm interested in doing. And my primary interest is just enhancing the educational experience, the educational research experience in different ways. So that's the context of the data I collected, and you'll see as I move forward, it'll be, I think, clear to you how this translates into scales, but I won't actually be presenting the scales to you today. Okay, now before we move forward, let me address the elephant in the room. Now, the elephant in the room is what I call zero-sum thinking about inclusive education. And zero-sum thinking about inclusive education is, well, if we let these other groups in, this group is suffering. I'm being particularly vague here, but I know you all know the context of what I'm talking about. This is, of course, a perverse understanding of inclusion. If we were at a, I don't know, discourse analysis conference, I might enter into an analysis of how Orwellian is the time that we are in, and how concepts like inclusion could be warped into this perverse understanding of exclusion. But we're not at that conference, and that's all I'll say about it now. But I do want to say something about inclusion. And what I want to say about inclusion is actually really, I have two very basic things to say about inclusion before we enter into the study itself. One is, I basically think that good teaching is inclusive teaching. Forget any other term we give to this, any other framework we add to this. If you're working in the classroom, you're working in a lab, you're working with students, I assume you want everybody to succeed. That, by definition, for me, is what inclusive education is about. It's not about a political agenda. I understand how it can be seen as a political agenda, but it's not about that. It's just about good education. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say, and it was helpful for me to hear from some of you before this session started, just to get some understanding of the context we're in. What we know about course-based research experiences, or one of the things we know, and you can look at some of my research in this level, but there's lots of other people that you could look at, like Mika Estrada, Paul Hernandez. There's a lot of people, Mark Graham, there's a lot of people you can look at. And what it basically shows is that course-based research experiences have something within them which makes them more equitable and more inclusive upfront. So whatever I'm going to say today adds on, I think, what are basic structural elements within a course-based research experience, which in itself leads to more of an inclusive educational experience and more inclusive framework. So with that, let me just say one other thing about the title itself. It says an analysis of large-scale qualitative data. What makes doing research easy for me is I do the assessment of the C program, the C phages program. Any question I have over a year, 8,000 student responses. Because of the size of the program, because of the size of the number of schools, and I have a great deal of diversity. So when I say an analysis of large-scale qualitative data, I mean large-scale qualitative data. I have nothing against small-scale qualitative data. This is not a methodological argument against that. But I think there is some value in having a large number of students respond to a piece of work when you're collecting data, and this is now that causes problems in analysis when you have large-scale qualitative data, but I'll speak about that shortly. So now let me start. So as I said before, I'm giving a very basic definition of inclusive education. But basically, my idea is this: anybody with any sort of background, personal history, any level of a challenge of this type or another, I think everybody deserves a quality education. And I think it's our role to do as much as is possible to lead to that outcome. That's what I mean by inclusive education. As I said, I do not consider this to be a political agenda. I consider this to be the basic aspect of any education in any field, but particularly in my case in STEM. So why should we study inclusion? What's the issue? Well, I would say this is a social justice issue in the sense that we do know from past studies, and there's been a lot of them, and large-scale studies at that, that it's not equitably distributed. We know that we have biases of this kind or another within the educational system. We know that there are drop-off rates at points at which people do not continue into STEM education or never enter in the first place, never even get there. So it is an issue of who's there and how we keep the people who are there to stay there. I mean, the persistence framework goes along very nicely with the inclusion framework. We know that STEM education or lack thereof leads to economic imbalances. We also know, and I think this is a particularly important aspect, which is spoken of, I think, but perhaps should be spoken of more. We limit the scientific questions we're going to ask, the solutions, the methods, the perspectives, what types of studies we do, who we do them on, if we don't have some degree of inclusiveness in the whole system. We have shortages in STEM workforce. We're going to have more shortages because of current short-sighted views on science education and funding, untapped talent. And of course, I think this is a really important one, and we see it now very powerfully, increased societal scientific illiteracy, people just not understanding, to the degree that you have an attack on experts and you have idiots who are sitting on the toilet and thinking up ideas and thinking that's a theory and not understanding the difference between that and a scientific theory, a data-driven theory. But I won't. I'm really trying very hard to keep this under control. But as you can see, I'm not doing so hot. So let me be more technical. Okay, so I'm not going to discuss my quantitative data, although I have a ton of quantitative data about this as well. But I did want to show this very brief structural equation model for one particular reason. Before I did what I'm doing at the moment, which is evaluating how to fit in inclusive education and what's involved in it and how students understand it, I assumed this was an outcome of course-based research experience. In other words, I assumed it was on the back end of it. But actually, the structural equation models I've been developing, and I have very, very good fit statistics, which I put up here, suggest actually that inclusion is a precursor. It's a predictor of. So high project ownership is predicted by inclusion. Science identity is predicted by inclusion, higher levels of inclusion, higher levels of both of those. And both of those things predict persistence, in fact, in a very powerful way. I won't show you the whole model, but what I'm trying to point out here is, yes, inclusion is a basic aspect of education. But in relation to a course-based research experience, it's also a predictor of all the other variables that I measure in my other job as an assessment person of CREs. So I think this is worthwhile paying attention to. As I said, I'm not going to go in too deep into my quantitative data. Invite me back next year. I'll be happy to tell you about new scales and some more about this data and how it works. Okay, so let me tell you about the method. So I send out a survey every semester. It's called the Persistence in the Sciences, or the PITS, if you like. It's a good survey. It's been used tens of thousands of times. Evaluates a research experience. I added into that a component, and I'll show you the questions in just one second, but I added into that a component which asked about inclusion, quantitatively and qualitatively, and I'm going to present the analysis of the qualitative side of that data. It went out one semester. I had 3,413 students respond overall to the PIT survey, and 2,783, which I might point out is a very high response rate, actually bothered to write down what they were thinking about inclusion. And that says something actually about how they evaluate the importance of this question, because this was at the very end of the survey, and they could easily, and it's not required, so they could easily just throw it off and not respond. Now, I do want to say something about the bias in the sample itself, because I think we need to address this when we think about the results I'm going to show you shortly. Predominantly women, predominantly high GPA, predominantly white, and predominantly freshmen. Now, there is some diversity within this. So we do have men, we do have lower GPAs, we do have a range of different ethnicities, but still the central tendency here is towards a very particular population. And I think this can mess up the frequencies of what I'm going to tell you. I don't think it messes up, though, the content. In other words, I think the frequencies might change if we had different populations. And I will look at some of these subsets here when I have enough time to do it. At the moment, I'm in the middle of analyzing a large set of data, but I will get back to it. But I just wanted to point this out before we enter into the analysis. The frequencies, I'll present to you the frequencies. I think, though, they reflect the particular set of participants more than might be the case in other populations. Okay. Oops. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So these were the questions. I had 3 quantitative questions. They were tested. I really dislike these questions, and I'm going to throw them out, and that's why I did this study, but you should know what they are, and I'm not really going to talk about them very much, except to say that the inclusion measure I spoke of before was the average of these 3 results. I feel included in my course, I feel included in STEM courses, I feel included in my institution. The qualitative question is more interesting, though. So you can think of the quantitative as a kind of a priming exercise. I primed you to answer the question about your inclusion. Now I'm going to ask you a real question, and that is, please explain what has led to your sense of feeling included or excluded in your course-based research lab. So they were primed with the quantitative questions, and then they answered written answers, the qualitative question. Let me say something about the analytical approach. We used an open coding approach, basically a more systematic content analysis type of thing. So we did open reading. We then developed a codebook of categories, category name, definition, example. We then validated that using 2 applied linguists. I have access to a whole doctoral program of applied linguists that I train, and they become my research assistants and they help me, and that's great. We then did independent coding and agreement checking, 86% agreement. That's not great, but it's not terrible. It's enough to be reliable because, remember, I'm trying to create scales that I'm going to be part of a subsequent study. And then we did coding and frequency counts. Okay, so the results are going to divide up into 2. I'm going to give you explanations of inclusion. I'm going to follow that with explanations of exclusion. Each of these was defined by the response itself, not we told them, tell us about inclusion or tell us about exclusion. The student decided what they wanted to tell us about. And as I said, I'm going to present the frequencies. I would be skeptical of them just because of the population. So I think it's more the categories that are of interest, less the frequencies of those categories. I'm going to explain each one of these in detail, but it's interesting just to see the big picture, I think, up front. And I will also end with a big picture, more inclusive big picture. So what makes you feel included? These are students' responses, course structure. That's what I meant by the CRE. You'll see it in a second. Instructor behavior, peer interactions, personal feelings, and institutional factors. And now what I'm going to do is, please note that course structure and instructor behavior is above 50%. Once again, that might change with a different population, but still, that's an interesting thing because both of those we control. In other words, both of those are things that an instructor can control. We can do something about them. Personal feelings and even institutional factors. I don't know how much. I speak to my dean all the time because he phones me up every 10 minutes and wants me to assess something, but then he never listens to me. Like, never ever. He partially listens to me and then he says, well, yeah, well, costs money or time or whatever, and then he doesn't do it. So I don't know. I have very I've had a very bad track record of changing dean's institutional approach to a college. Perhaps you're better placed than me, I don't know. Okay, let's look at some details. So course structure, this was the biggest, highest frequency item. And I think everything I'm about to tell you, I think is specific to a course-based research experience. One of these, I think, is specific to the C program or other large-scale IREX like Small Worlds, and there's a few other versions of it. So what makes a student feel included? Well, small class size makes people feel included. I guess it's more of the personal touch. Our course included 12 students, so it's very inclusive and close-knit between all of us. Each student interacted and so on. You get the picture. This one I like, group work and collaboration. I feel included in the course because I was able to collaborate with my classmates towards a common goal. You know, the central aspect of a CRE is that we're working towards a goal where students are working with faculty to generate real research. They have a real goal. Working together with the instructor, with other students, enhances inclusion. Everyone doing the same work. I'm not sure this is true in every CRE design. It is true for the C. This is data that was collected from the C. But the student felt that they were included because they were all doing the same thing. I loved this one, particularly for CRE-based research. Opportunity to present findings. So everyone got to participate in the research and presenting the research. And I think this is true C Symposium, but that's a really nice thing, right? That students, it made them feel that they were included, not because of what happened in the classroom, but also because of what happened with their data and what they did with it. I also like this, being given a specific job or role. So the positioning of the student, you know, like giving them a role, making them do something in the classroom changes the power relations and then also enhances inclusion. So those are, I think, features of a CRE, actually, and I think this is one of the reasons why CRE lead to equitable outcomes. Now, instructor behaviors, there's no surprises here, but it's worth saying, right? If you're nasty and grim and mean, it does not lead to inclusion. Like a lot of the teachers I had actually in my education, which might explain everything about what I do in life. But anyway, the instructor being approachable, helpful, and willing to answer questions leads to inclusion. The instructor being welcoming and creating a welcoming and supportive environment leads to inclusion. The instructor emphasizing participation and collaboration. This is kind of interesting and once again, a CRE feature, I think, working with students to create that collaboration. We're working together, we're participating, and we're doing together. And of course, the instructor treating students equally and fairly. And we're going to see the reverse of this in what makes exclusion. I'm going to say exactly the same thing in reverse from student responses. This is an interesting one, peer interactions and relationships. From a frequency level, this was the third highest. Having friends in the class. I don't know if you can change having friends in the class. I don't know how much control you have, but the ones that come afterwards, I think we definitely can do something about. Positive and helpful classmates. So fostering that environment where people help people rather than competition, rather than, you know, beating other people down, creating this sense of we're all working towards the creation of scientific knowledge. This is how science is done. Be positive and helpful towards your classmates. Working with a lab partner, the same concept, the same idea, doing work together, feeling like part of a team and fostering that feeling about part of a team. And open communication and discussion with others and with the professor. Personal feeling. So these are interesting, as you'll see. When we see the reverse of this, it becomes even more interesting. But I think this is, there's a piece here that interests me a lot. So feeling competent and able to contribute. This is a self-efficacy issue, right? So it's interesting. If you can promote a greater sense of competence, you're also generating a greater sense of inclusion, which is an interesting finding, like in itself, that these two things work together. Feel like the work is important and valued. I think this is once again central to the CREE agenda. You're not just doing busy work. You're not just learning a procedure. You're doing it in order to generate data. What you're doing is important. Enjoying the course material. One of the things we measure on the PITS actually is positive emotions towards your own work. Excellent predictor of persistence, among other things. Having prior experience, I think this is something worth paying attention to. Students who perhaps don't have enough required background, you might want to pay attention to them. You might want to provide some buddy system where they're helped out, because it will lead to feeling excluded. And you're going to see how this comes back in the exclusion explanations as well. And I like this as well, connecting with others on a personal level. I call this the pizza phenomena. Bring pizza or coffee or whatever, right? But not because they're hungry, although we do have sometimes students who are hungry. I had a homeless student last semester. I didn't know he was homeless until close to the end, but it happens. But what I mean is that connection, that human connection in the classroom also lends itself to inclusion. Institutional factors. So if you read the literature on inclusion, you'll see that these are very, the diversity and representation is very prominent. And it might be, as I said, this is where I think part of that bias does come in, of the overall population leading into the frequencies of response. But this is one of the issues which can lead to a feeling of inclusion or lack thereof. Seeing other scientists that come from a similar background as me, broadly, available resources and support, like the university making a student feel included, opportunities to get involved, and a welcoming and inclusive atmosphere. Okay, so those are factors for inclusion. Now let's look at some factors for exclusion. Once again, so I should say there were far fewer comments about exclusion and inclusion within the C, but that might say something about the C. I wouldn't pay too much attention to the frequencies here. So these are lack of engagement. So I call this the institutional student, disengaged learner. I don't really feel neither included nor excluded. I'm just taking classes and going home. I'm here for the degree, but I'm not actually engaged. I don't have ownership. There are going to be students like that. We try to bring them in, but this is a reason for people to feel excluded. Or perhaps a lack of interest. I feel that although the field of biology is interesting, this is not for me and my interests. This is the reverse of the self-efficacy issue I just spoke of. Academic challenges and self-doubt. So what's imposter syndrome? I feel like I'm an imposter sometimes due to not understanding what is happening at the moment sometimes. In other words, that issue of knowledge, skill, ability, background leads to the sense of I don't know what I'm doing. And that leads to the sense of being excluded, and also leads to this phenomenon of feeling like I'm an imposter. I really shouldn't. Imposter meaning I really am not qualified to be here, or I shouldn't be here. Lack of understanding and knowledge. I took my core biology a while ago. I don't remember much. And as I said before, in the inclusion scales, this is a reason for feeling excluded. And the knowledge gap. I think this is something I'm definitely guilty of as a teacher. You kind of teach to the strong, I think, is a natural tendency. And sometimes you have students who haven't got the required background or haven't got enough of the required background. There's a knowledge gap. And then that causes this sort of distancing. And if we can, it would be nice to avoid that. I think this is obvious, but it's very well worth pointing out. The only reason I felt excluded in this laboratory course is due to our TA. I felt that she was more helpful to other groups than my particular group. That sense of inequitable responsiveness definitely leads to exclusion. The sense of you're helping that person over there, but you're not helping me, or you're helping that person over there more without explaining why, and you're not helping me. And the same is true for instructor support. There's a sense of exclusion in the class as certain students seem to receive more attention, while I often find myself receiving more negative than positive feedback. So how the instructor is interacting in the CRE leading to these sense of exclusion. Negative group work interactions or lack of peer support or negative group dynamics. I think the nature of the CRE involves often dyad or small group work. We can't assume that just because we put people in a group that they work well in a group. It often needs some support, some navigation, some encouragement. It can lead to a sense of exclusion if this works negatively. And also limited ability to interact. I sometimes feel excluded because of my group members and then underestimating my ability to get work done. This is the phenomenon of who speaks, right? Who speaks, how much they speak. I've been speaking for 45 minutes, right? I hope it's not causing you exclusion, but it's a problem, right? That's always a sense if it happens in a small group. I won't say much about this large class size, but I did think this was interesting, the second comment here. If I could have a simple conversation with my professor, I would feel more included. Now, I'm not sure it has to be the professor. Perhaps it can be a more experienced student, perhaps it can be a graduate student, perhaps it can be someone else, but that sense of not having anyone to talk to, I think definitely leads to I'm off by myself. And, you know, personality traits. Well, if you're shy and painfully shy, as one student here pointed out, I don't know how much we can interact with this. We're not psychologists or counselors. But it does lead to, and if you notice it, perhaps something can be done. I'm not sure. Social isolation, this is the representation and diversity issue. Standing out, I think, can cause a sense of exclusion. I can speak for a lot of Black students when I say that a lot of times we're the only Black person in the science lab. And that leads to a sense of feeling excluded. I think some of the other things we can do that we've just been talking about might help her to alleviate this to a certain extent, but you can see how this might function. And limited support, I don't feel as valued as an institution. The translation of I'm not getting enough support in the sense I'm not valued, and therefore I'm excluded. Okay, I've been talking a long time, and I see I'm really on time, which is unusual for me. So let me give you a summarizing model, the way I see this at the moment, and then I'll give some final comments and I'll be happy to answer any questions. So in the center, I wrote features of a CRE that enhance inclusion. So I do think that course-based research experiences enhance inclusion. I know the statistical data, my own and other people's, that this leads to better results in relation to different demographics. But I think here we have some data on the features of the design which lead to inclusion: small classes, group work, collaboration, public presentation, and giving a role. All of these things which are part of a CRE. Then we have, I think, on top of that, some enhancing factors. And when I say enhancing factors, things that we perhaps can, pay attention to. I don't think there's anything surprising here, but I think we can pay attention to them. Being helpful, supportive, and treating everybody equitably, whether it's an instructor, whether it's a TA, whoever's in there in the lab working with these students, just creating this sense of we're working together, making sure collaborative work and communication is constructive. People can be mean, students can be mean, stuff can happen. Just as much, I know you can't control every moment, every interaction, but working towards that, I think, is a good idea. Promoting a sense of teamwork. I think this is relatively easy in a course-based research experience because we're generating data. The data is going to be used. So it is teamwork. We do it together. We're trying to do something. Addressing personal feelings of self-efficacy and value, making students feel that if, the work they're doing is valuable, and if there is a lack of skill or a lack of knowledge, we can enhance that. We can provide that within the course, and you can move forward. And of course, providing positive role models and support for all students as much as is possible. So those are, I think, enhancing factors on top of the core features of the CRE. Limiting factors, things which take away from the power of the CRE to create an inclusive environment. So personal feelings of incompetence and inability to contribute. I think we can interact with this, but I think if this happens, it's something that's going to reduce the sense of inclusion, which, as I said before, will reduce the effect of the research experience, which will reduce persistence, which will lead to leaving STEM. Feeling of lack of support and inequitable attention. Pay attention to your TAs if they're in the class. Pay attention to yourself. Make sure that you can give a sense of equitable. Doesn't mean that you give exactly the same amount of time to everybody, but it means you do address the issues if they come up. Negative collaborative experiences, I would try as much as is possible to avoid this, or have some feedback loop where if this does happen, it can be resolved so it's not an ongoing issue. Social anxiety and shyness, I don't know how much we can deal with this, but this work can lead to sense of exclusion. And social distancing through a lack of positive role models. Once again, if we can find positive role models, we can bring in students, graduates, faculty members. I think that's a good idea. I know this is not only under your control. Okay, so let me say this. I encourage you to, when you get a chance, take a look at a paper we wrote in the C about models of CRE education. It's in CBLSE. If you put in my name and 100 other people's names, you'll find this paper. But one of the things I learned from that paper, and where I'd like to end today, is we are, as professionals working in a course-based research experience, our knowledge as researchers, our knowledge as methodologists, our knowledge of the field are all very important and central to what we do. But there is also what I would call social, psychological, emotional support role that we have because of the nature of a CRE, because we're putting students in groups, because we're working to get real results, because we're giving students roles in different ways. So we are navigating some of the sort of interactional aspects of the student. There are failures when you do a CRE. There are challenges when you do a CRE. This is not like the traditional lab where if you do the procedure correctly, you get the result. That's why the protocol is there. Here you have things. So our roles take on a slightly different framework where we are navigating frustration and anxiety and self-doubt. And I think when we do that well, and if you think about all the items we've just looked at, it creates this sense of enhanced inclusion, which I think can play a heavy role actually in making the research experience better. And that in turn leads to increased persistence for as many people as possible. So with that, I'll end. Thank you for listening. As I said, at this moment, as we're sitting here, I just about 2 hours before we met, I closed the survey from the sea. So I now have data on the scales which came out of this. And I will be during the summer doing the analysis. And I'd be happy to hear your questions and whatever comments you have. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. I appreciate it.
Let me stop the share if I know how to do that. Okay, here we go.
Much.
Yeah. There we go.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Paul, could we put on the screen the slide with Dr. Hanauer, please, while we ask questions. So I'll open it up for questions now. Thank you so much for such an enlightening talk. I don't see any questions in the chat, but I'd like to just start off by asking you about teaching assistants, because they definitely play a role in what's going on in the classroom. What are your thoughts on undergraduate teaching assistants?
Okay, so I did a study of undergraduate teaching assistants, but I'll try and limit myself to the question on hand. So first, let me just give a truism. And the truism is this, and it's true of students, faculty, and a lot of other people. We tend to teach the way we were taught. And the way we were taught is often not optimal. In fact, it often comes down to me telling you what to do and what to think and what the right answer is. And that is not necessarily the model of education that is going to work well for a TA in a research-based experience. So with TAs, I know that there are always training programs for these TAs. One of the things I would emphasize is the positive, constructive, collaborative role that they play like you play. In other words, it's a matter of, I would make it a matter of, if they can respond and help support addressing the issues, the challenges, the anxieties, sort of oil the wheels of the team group work, I think that's important. I think it just needs to be said to TAs. I think it needs to be said and pointed out that that is one of their roles. That is one of the reasons they're there. If we can have some diversity of TAs, that might alleviate some of perhaps some of the issues of representativeness that might not be there. It might be or might not, but that's also a role they can play. They definitely need training, though, and it needs to be said. Don't assume that just because they're a student, and that they've been through the CRE that they're working in, that they understand what their role is here. They may understand their role as, I'll tell you what to do. So yeah.
Thank you for that. So
I appreciate does it make sense?
It does. It does. So what we'll do is we'll, as hands are raised, and then I'll also go to the chat as well. So Mike, your hand is up, please. unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. I just have a question. It's something that I've asked as many people as I can, and it deals with the nature of how science works. And that you touched on it during your talk about, the high rate of, I don't want to call it failure, but we intend to get somewhere, and we know there's setbacks along the way, and it's really a metaphor of what life is. But students often are, especially in some of their other courses, they're evaluated based on their ability to get the thing done, like percent yields and things like that. And it's really counter to what we're trying to do in a discovery-based course. So I guess my question to you is, how do you balance that and remain inclusive of students that, I have a few strategies I've tried, but I'm just wondering what strategies you employ when students are kind of hitting that wall and they feel like they can't get over the wall, and it kind of becomes a barrier to their learning in the course because of their perception that they are a failure.
Yeah, so excellent question. And I fully understand where you're coming from. So I'm gonna answer this as a true assessment person for a second, and then I'll come back and be more human about it. One of the things we know about a course-based research experience is that for it to be a real research experience, the student has to develop something called project ownership. Project ownership is the sense that the work I am doing has a personal meaning for me, and also is of value. Forget the classroom, forget the grade, is of value to this broader community beyond the classroom. Now, you're absolutely right. This variable is a variable we measure. There's a project ownership scale. This variable is the exact opposite from, okay, I need to get an A, which means I need to perform perfectly, which means I need to get these results, and I need to get them consistently throughout the course, which we all know within a research experience is not the way it works. So now having said that let me just finish that thought. If you cannot generate, I don't mean you, I mean, if we in a course cannot generate project ownership, we know that this has a knock-on effect in structural equation modeling to the other variables and reduces persistence at the end of that pathway of things. Now let me take a step back and speak about this differently from within the study that we're talking about. I think that in the same way that I just said about TAs, I think students come into our classrooms, our course-based research experiences, often with a very different set of expectations about what it is they're really doing. The key to changing their perception is having the understanding that what we're doing is not a procedure, but generating data, and that generating data involves failure. In other words, it involves a process. So understanding, if you like, the nature of the science at the heart of the CRE and how that works is an exercise in trying to change how they're perceiving their education. I read a whole book about this, by the way. One of the first books I ever wrote was about this sense of, is education backward looking? We know everything, and therefore you just have to learn it for students, or is it forward looking? We don't know. What we know is a procedure. We can generate data. We can generate knowledge. And I think playing around with that and explaining the different nature of the CRE is important for students. Now, will you reach everybody? I don't think so. I mean, I think I'm realistic about education, but we do know from large-scale studies, including my own, that we reach a large number of students from a very wide range of backgrounds. So it definitely can be done. But I think it has to be done explicitly. You have to respond initially upfront by explaining the nature of a creed, they won't believe you. But once they have a result, once they have an electron microscope picture of something, or they have some participation in some sort of discovery, it does change the perception. Or they see their data or someone else's data in the classroom used by a scientist. It has an effect. It's difficult, though. I'm not trying to minimize the question. Does that help you in some way?
I like what you're saying about the backward thinking, forward thinking approach. I think that's a really powerful way for the students to understand that, you know, we are, I usually show them a excellent TED talk about the cloud. I don't know if anybody's ever seen that.
Mhm.
You know, living in the cloud is an unknown. We don't know where we are, but that's what's exciting about it. So thank you for that.
Thank you for your question. So we have 3 questions in the chat, and I'd like to just at least touch bases on 3 of them. So from Trisha Malloy, what are some ways we can more effectively reach quieter or shy students when troubleshooting during the lab period? I'd also like for you to address the second question in the chat regarding TAs, so that question came up in the chat, and how they can, from Tina, what is the training for those TAs? So if you could just address those 2 questions, and then I'll ask the third question, because we are short for time.
Okay.
In a
Yeah,
probably 1 to 2 minutes.
yeah, sure. Yeah. I'm well known for the 8-hour class, by the way. So, anyway, but that's why I'm never on time. But anyway, so shy students. So I don't think we can change personality traits. However, I do think that in the course-based research experience, we have options of interacting with shy students, which are better than in some other situations. And what I mean by that is we do have, I would say, indirect routes to working with a shy student through groups and sort of talking to the group, making sure that the group design involves everybody responding and not forcing people. I mean, you wouldn't know it, but I'm a pretty shy person on the whole when I'm not in my persona of university professor and somebody who's talking a lot. Like, it's easy to not be shy in this sort of setting. I think if we can give a role, put them in good groups where there is a good dynamic, I think it should alleviate some of being shy. Will it overcome everything? I don't think so. And I think there's a limit to what we need to be realistic about what we can do as teachers. Once again, we are not counselors, we are not psychologists, we're not giving that sort of advice. But I do think a role within a group with positive dynamics should help even the shyest person to talk, interact, and pay attention. If you do see someone not participating, not talking, don't put a flash, you know, don't put them in the center of attention, because that will really knock them out. But you can sort of gently push them within the group setting to be more assertive. Training for TAs. So I'll say, I'll do this very, very quickly. So first of all, in a CRE, I don't think you should have a TA who hasn't done that CRE. And I don't think you should have a TA who hasn't done that CRE and participated in a positive, collaborative way. And so I think there's a choice thing going on there, who we want to be our TAs in our classroom. So that's one piece. The second piece is, I do think explicit statements about inclusion, the nature of a CRE, how we work, and what their role is, can help. And you can model that for them. And we do know something about how CREs work. There is published literature, some of my own as well, where we specifically talk about the models of instruction and how they work, the models of assessment and how they work in a CRE. And I would make that part of the training framework. So not just knowledge, not just a good student, not just ability, but actually a team player, collaborative, understanding how science works, understanding the role of navigating, supporting, helping others. And if we can create a more, this can sound very left-wing progressive, although I would see it as conservative Christian myself. But anyway, caring environment, I think, is a good way to go. That's what I think. If we can create that sort of caring sense, not competition, not zero-sum game, but rather we're working together as a team to create knowledge. If we can do that, I think that can help. That's in
Thank
2
you.
seconds. And I
I
could go.
appreciate that. Could you give me one number? How long or how many cures do you think are required for students to see the positive outcomes in your analysis? That's a question from Elizabeth Sandquist in persistence. Just
Okay,
we
so
need
this, yeah, so I can answer this question
Yes.
actually because it's been a research question that I've been looking at a lot. Not only how many courses, how long in a course do you need to see positive outcomes? So I have a paper on short-term research experiences. Short-term research experiences was about 1 month. It was about a third of a semester. We did see some positive outcomes. However, we didn't see the development of project ownership, and that is an issue. I would say 1 semester leads to positive outcomes. I'm now looking at what happens in 2 semesters and 3 semesters and 4 semesters. I have the data. I haven't quite done the analysis, but I do know that after 1 semester, you have positive outcomes. After 2 semesters, you have even more positive outcomes, which is one of the reasons why in the CPhages, the bioinformatics has a higher level of research experience and persistent than the first semester. So that follow through has an effect. Once again, invite me back in a year and I'll tell you about 3 semesters as I look at the C genes. Invite back in 2 years, I'll tell you about the continuation of that 4 semesters. But I think 1 semester, even just 1 semester, 1 course, 1 semester, we know has a positive effect.
Thank you so very
Increases number
much.
of courses you do. Yeah, excellent question. I think about this a lot. What the added value of additional courses. There are new variables that come into play. I'm looking now at if you have 2 semesters or 3 semesters, does that increase your grit, which is a variable of resilience to face, sort of like the question that Mike asked before, to increase your ability to sort of handle failure. These are questions that are part of that research design, and I hope to have answers in the coming year or so.